This is God and Autobiography, the podcast, a dramatic adaptation and continuing discussion of the book, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin. He was a lifelong agnostic, but one day he had an occasion to pray. To his vast surprise, God answered in words. Being a philosopher, he had a lot of questions, and God had a lot to tell him. Episode 209. Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Langdon. This is episode 209 and our 30th edition of What's on Our Mind. On this week's episode, Jerry and I dig deeply into the profound truth that God desires a relationship with humanity. We talk about the complexities of divine communication and how it transforms both God and humans through shared experiences. We also reflect on the power of empathy in communication, recognizing that the art of just being there for someone is a profound form of help that resonates with the divine presence itself. Thanks for spending this time with us. Here's what's on our mind. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of What's on Our Mind. Jerry's back with me. I'm Scott Langdon. Jerry, it's really good to see you this week.
Well, good to see you, Scott. And I think we've got some interesting things to talk about here.
I do too. This unit of episodes that we've been talking on centers around episode 22. And this episode we've titled, I Learn How God Communicates. And I'm so fascinated by this chapter, going back and listening to it again and preparing it to be used for episode 25 this time, which was a replay of this episode to get us ready for Ajit Das's Life Wisdom Project was the episode that you and he talked about. And in this episode, I learn how God communicates. It seems so important to me because what you always talk about is the relationship aspect. And there really isn't, it seems to me, anything else in relationship but communication. If you have otherness, there is communication. Without otherness, there is no communication. So there's something about God, to me, wanting to create otherness that creates communication and the need for it. And it's so interesting to maybe, as you've mentioned to me before, this chapter might encapsulate a lot of what God is trying to communicate to you about the whole book.
Yeah, that's right. You remember at the very beginning, I was told the first time God put me on this project, I want you to tell my story. And I didn't even know God had a story, you might say. But I asked, of course, what does that involve? And one of the key things God says, the story is always told from the human side. And I want people to understand what it is like for me. And again,
what it's like to be God.
What it is like for God to engage in this long creation, then interaction with human beings, and of course, other elements of the universe, but particularly with human beings. And again, at the time, I didn't know there was anything what it's like to be God, but there is something that is that question. And it was taking my mind to the very end of the book, which at the time it happened, I thought, well, it didn't seem to end with a bang, but as I went back and reread it, and I'll just share that again, where does it end? And it's really what's the point of the whole thing? And I'm trying to sum it up, trying to figure out what's our connection to God. And I say, is this right, Lord? That what one knows, when one knows God is not an inert fact. Oh, here I am, there's a God. Not an inert fact. It is a living reality that places demands on us and transforms us. God says yes. And then I go on, as if this were your sole reason for being. Yes. And that's where the book ends. And it was only after rereading that I thought, God has just given an explanation for why there's a world at all. You know, and it's not a causal explanation, but it's what they call a teleological explanation, you know, in terms of the purpose. What was the purpose of there being a world? Well, God is telling me here, it's so that God can have this relationship to human beings, to us. And we are God's reason for being. And what does that involve? As you just said, Scott, uh, it involves, like any relationship, communication, because you got, you know, just here's one person, here's another person. Think of a friend, for example. Uh, you're two different people. Well, what's the connect? You got to have a connector between you, and that's communication. And so, God, having created this world, and of course, we learn early in God and Autobiography, in the early episodes, that it's presented as if it feels to me, as I'm sort of sensing God, as if God is sort of like lonely. Well, in those early eons, you know, God doesn't have the opportunity to relate to human beings yet. And so God is almost tapping God, remember, doesn't know the future, not in any definitive way in the account God gives me, but is following developments and following developments. And then it's kind of wonderful because animal life starts coming along and human life, and God starts interacting with people, and God learning from that interaction. This God's coming into being the way we all coming into being in relation to other people. I'm told at one point the personal is interpersonal. That's how you become a person. It's by relating to other people. And so God is going through that process. But uh, but it's a strange process because I don't know if there are any plays like this, Scott, but it's as if the main character in the play never appears on stage, but is sending signals in some indirect way to the players on the stage. And that's us. We're the players on the stage. And how do these signals come? And of course, they're not normally like telegram arrive. There's a telegram from God. The scriptures can be presented that way, can be understood as divine communication. So that's important. The scriptures were originally, of course, individual experiences of the divine or the ultimate. The divine, you know, my experience of God is the personal side, but God is bigger than that. And there's a divine reality that includes a kind of transpersonal aspect that is more explored often by the Eastern traditions. And so there are these multiple ways God is making God's self evident to us, and yet we don't notice that. And yet, and a part of the value for each and every one of us of this episode is that God lays out one way he communicates after another, after another, after another, after another. And those include the Eastern ways, meditation, taking in what I think of as an almost aesthetic mode, reality just as it presents itself, as it is, without trying to either make use of it or theorize about it, put it into categories, but just connecting with it. And in my experience through prayer and a lot of what God is doing is trying to get you to do something or to not do something. The voice of conscience is one of the many ways God communicates. And we're all somewhat aware of that. You know, we often don't think, well, that's God. And you don't need to think if it's God. If it got some sense of right and wrong, then that's going to be helpful to you in living a better human life. And then there are these other ways, just through contemplation and God putting a task in your path, and some other things we've talked about at other times. But But just pause there for a moment because it is quite a diversity of arrays, and it's a mistake that some religious people make of thinking there's one and only one way. I know there are groups, I have hear a voice, and there are people who think, oh, I want to hear a voice, I want to hear a voice. You don't need to hear a voice. Let God communicate with you however God comes to you. And it was helpful for me for God to talk to me because God wanted me to write a book. But if God doesn't want you to write a book, why does God need to do that? Why isn't it enough? Why isn't it enough for God just to put a task in your path and you kind of recognize, oh, I think this is for me. This is a kind of calling. I'm supposed to pick up this thread and follow it. And why isn't that enough? Or just those deep urges you feel in your deep pits of your stomach or wherever it is, your chest, that, oh, this is right. This is what I should do. Or, uh-oh, this is wrong. Often if temptations come your way, you're very drawn to it, but there's some deeper feeling that, uh-oh, I'm about to go astray here. I'm about to make a mistake. And so there's a wide array. And that strike you, Scott, this tremendous array of the ways God manifests God's self to us.
Yes, and God says to you when you ask him, is in the Hindu tradition, the idea that everything is essentially God. Is that right? And God just says, yes, that's right. And yet, the building on that, so if we started there, then the possibility that everything and anything could be a communication from God is a possibility. It's possible. And God lists to you the myriad ways God communicates: intuition, other people, a voice sometimes, an algorithm in a YouTube thing. Oh, should I watch this? Like the urge, the impulse to, should I follow this way or that way? This seems to be the way. That is a communication from God. I am really interested in terms of the communication about two parts that are involved in communication. One is, well, when I think about it broadly, and I think about myself in terms of communication with someone else, there is a desire to be understood. And number two, there's a desire to understand. And often I find myself, if I get kind of caught up or if there's trouble in communication, I often find that my desire to be understood is out front. It leads. And what's behind that, coming in a distant second often, is my desire to understand the other. In God, we have both of those things going on. God says to you, what I want more than anything is to be understood and taken in. And I feel that desire. As I said, it's the one that leads often. But we often, but God sets up his relationship with you with the single word, listen. To me, demonstrating that in order to have communication, start from the listening place, start from the place of seeking to understand first, and perhaps the communication might go smoothly.
Well, yeah, you want to talk to another person. You want to be understood by a person, but that means it's not just understood by a robot, you might say, but understood by someone you understand. That if you have no kind of empathy, no sense of that person, what life is like for them, and what their interest might be in you, why are you talking? Is there you share a goal? Is it enjoyment? I've heard a good joke, and so you share a good joke. There are all many reasons for communicating, but you need to have some sense of what are we doing together? It's not a solo thing of sending out bottles to sea. Hey, understand me. You want that, but you want them to send some bottles to sea that arrive on your island, right? And you're taking in, and then that's a full relationship. I know I'm told in the context of love, God says any one way love is incomplete and sort of a failure. The way a one-way communication would be if nobody's listening. Well, it's not a communication at all. And love, well, you can be loving somebody, but you've got to connect with them, or you don't have a love relationship. And so that's part of God's experience. God's trying to have, you might call it a love relationship. It's not just woozy like that, but it's a working relationship also, trying to have a relationship with us. And so that we can take God in, and God already has a great sense of us. But I'm told at one point, I don't read your minds. That's why you need to pray. Tell me how it is with you. And in the Old Testament, God heard the cries of the people in Egypt and remembered his covenant. And so God, responds to that. People cry out, God responds. We need to cry out or say whatever else we have to say. My experience with God really began with expressing gratitude. Okay. And I didn't believe in a God, but it just seemed I had an experience for which I was grateful. And it seemed the right thing to do to express that because it came to my life from who knows where. And so, however this came to my life, thank you, thank you, thank you. What one writer calls just thanking your lucky stars. Sometimes it can be that. But you express how it is with you, and then God is trying to have you take in that partnership, the other side of that relationship. And that, I'm told, is God's reason for being. And that's how we both grow. That's how God grows, how we grow.
It's interesting. You were talking about empathy and how that relates to communication and suffering. And it just reminded me of this situation that happened to me last week. I went to my doctor's office, and the woman behind the counter checking me in and doing all that, I could tell she was in severe pain. Had to do something with her leg, but if she had to kind of get up out of the chair, oh man, the wince on her face, and it was just all over her. And I could just tell she was suffering so much. And I was standing there. It was just her on the other side of the counter and me, no one else in the waiting room or anything. And I was trying to think of the right thing to say. I was trying to think of, how are you? Or do you like the weather? Something. And what I realized was, and this was something that came to me, was this God giving me a nudge, perhaps, but it was, don't worry about yourself and how this will make you feel. Focus on her. And what I said was, I'm so sorry you're in such pain.
Good.
And she looked up at me, and that was the first time we actually connected in the eyes. And she smiled with pain behind it, but thank you, she just said. And then that was it. I couldn't do anything more for her. And this urge to be the helper, this urge to, I realized that would make me feel good. But there was more to it. I was like, I want to get beyond that. I really do want to connect with this person who seems to be in such deep pain. What can I do to help, to be the helper, to make it better? And this sense came to me, nothing except tell her how you see her, you see her, you're taking her in. And in a sense, that communication, that's all that was needed.
Yes, yes, we underestimate the value of simple presence. We're always trying to solve problems, and
Mm,
that's a great thing to do if you have a solution. And as you're right, Scott, that often makes the doer, feel better. But the first task, even before trying to solve the problem, is recognize the person as a person, show empathy, show some awareness of what they might be going through. You don't have to give a diagnostic if you misinterpret it. It's right. Maybe she's shifting around, but it's actually she's about to go through a difficult divorce. It doesn't matter whether you correctly identify, just show your presence. And that's a lot of the message that God has told me. What is God's help in the world? And God says, I'm not a rescue helicopter. And you weren't a rescue helicopter for that woman. And you knew it. You knew it. And God knows it. God is not a rescue helicopter. But the divine presence, God tells me, is itself the help. And that
mm,
sounds so little. It
mm,
sounds so little. But we know from our own daily experience that that is not little. I know when I had my first heart problem and was in at home afterwards, just a friend calling. How's it going? It just lifted my spirits unbelievably. Couldn't
mm,
cure my heart problem. I mean, the doctors had taken care of that, you might say, but it's an enormous value. And that's why I always like these bumper stickers that say, practice random acts of kindness,
mm. Yeah.
just to be kind to person, even congenial, nice to a person in the checkout at the grocery store. For God's side of this, since God's whole reason for being is this relationship and living lives of drama with us, it's not just a gazing in each other's eyes sort of relationship. You then move on in the world. There's a lot to be done in the world, and we're God's partners in that. But God says the anguish of being ignored and of people often willfully ignoring, kind of plugging their ears and going yana 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 or something. I'm not going to listen, not going to listen, uh, and often don't want to listen because I don't want to live better than I'm living now. I like you might say my crummy life because it's full of things I understand and enjoy. Uh, but God says there's no anguish like it. It's like the anguish of a parent who watches their kids go bad, that the parents is just torn up. There's nothing the parent can do. They're living their own lives, and yet it's as a parent, your whole reason for being is being defeated by one of the things you try to do is create um, good, happy kids, right? People who
Mm,
equipped to deal with adult life and have their own mental equipment together and emotional equipment together with some integration and integrity and competence and so forth, and ability to face life with good spirits and take in fully what it has to offer, the best that it has to offer, and to live that out and have successful personal relationships themselves and so on. Those are all the things you want. That's the reason for being of a parent. Well, that's God's reason for being.
we can understand that feeling. And if God is communicating to you that this is a deep anguish for me, like a father seeing a child go wrong, go bad. Um, when I think about my children who haven't gone bad, thank God, by any
Yes,
stretch of the
yes.
imagination, but when I think about when we are out of communication, my friend Scott and I talk about it as being in communication or out of communication. So if my um, son and I, for example, are out of communication, I find that I have some things that I feel like if I could only communicate this to him, he would get it and understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that's from my perspective. That's my perception of the situation. That if he would just heed this, whether or not that's correct, I know that feeling. Now, God obviously is God and knows God's will and knows what's best. And I can feel that what God wants for us is the right thing. It's God's will. And I don't always know what God's will is for my son, let's say. So I understand that I don't know the whole picture and all of that. At the same time, I feel like I can share or at least understand that feeling of wanting to communicate something that is not being heard, whether it's willfully or whether it's, and I always feel, even if it is willfully, that I still want to try something else that might work to get you to not be willfully ignoring me or whatever. Maybe if I come at it with a story, or maybe if I come at it from your point of view, or I'm always trying to communicate something that I'm failing to communicate. I have that desire, and I can understand that God would have that.
Yeah, and if the other person either isn't ready for this communication or willfully doesn't want it or whatever, can be many things. It's not necessarily a failing, but generally in our relation with God, if we aren't paying attention, that's a failing. This is part of what we need to do as human beings, is to try to have some sense in one of these modes or other. And it can be just aesthetic contemplation. You kind of look out there and because an awful lot what you need is to get distractions out and your own willful urges and your own ego and all of that stuff, and just relax and let the divine flow in, you might say.
Mm.
And then it doesn't have to be to big demands, but if you let the divine flow in, then you're in relationship. And sometimes that's what uh, uh, couples do, what families do. They just go to the beach and sit on the beach and enjoy each other's company. They aren't necessarily doing that much, but they're in that case, they're often sharing, you might say, roughly speaking, the same experience. They're all participating in the same event, having the same experience. You play tennis with your friend, that's
Mm-hmm.
not emotional communication per se, at least, although there may be overtones of that. Uh, but you're sharing an experience with each other, and you're giving each other enjoyment. And afterwards, you say, "Good game, thank you." Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a successful experience, and God is trying to have these various experiences with us, and also where there is necessary work to be done in the world, that you can make the world better or you can make it worse. And God is your partner in that, and you need to be God's partner in that. Then you might say it's sort of urgent. There's
Mm-hmm.
an emergency, let's say, and God needs to get in touch with you. Well, you need to be opening your telegrams or answering your phone or your text messages or whatever, and responding. Our job is to respond in such cases. And God will respond to us. We don't need to worry about God's end of this transaction, but we
Mm-hmm.
need to pay attention to our own. We need to be responding and trying to do as best we can discern what God would think is the best in this situation.
Often when I think about communication and a way to talk about completed communication and what that feels like is to talk about the theater and doing a play and being in the audience and that connection. In 2019, I was in Vero Beach, Florida, doing a production of Legally Blonde, and a friend of mine passed away. That it was very dear to me, and I was grieving that unexpected news and trying to go to work at night and do the show. And in some of my off time, I was looking on the computer and I saw this headline that Glenda Jackson, a great Academy Award winner, English actress, um, was doing King Lear on Broadway at the time. She was playing King Lear in the role of King Lear. And the New York Times came into her dressing room and was doing a little interview with her. And that's what I was seeing on this little video. And she said something about the theater that was just perfectly articulated what communication is like. And here's what she said. I wrote it down. She said, when theater works, a group of strangers come on in the light, and there is this other group of strangers sitting in the dark. an energy goes from the light to the dark and hopefully is reinforced and sent back to you. If that happens, a perfect circle is formed, and that is so unique. And I've been thinking about that for these 5 years since I heard it. And every time I work as an actor, I think about that and the idea that in that situation, I would be the one on stage, sending the energy out to the audience, those strangers in the dark. But then also, I've been in the audience and I've thought about it from the audience's point of view. How is it that I am participating in this situation here? These folks up here are sending this energy out to me and I'm receiving it. And how am I giving it back or not? And I've noticed lately, I've been to several things lately. Um, and I've noticed that sometimes if I'm not feeling well or something, I'm maybe not able to focus as well, or I drift in and out or something, or maybe somebody is acting poorly, in my opinion, or whatever. It's just not hitting me, maybe fall asleep. And then another show, a different performance, I'm riveted. Oh, what's this? And I'm trying to pay attention to those things and wonder how available am I on both sides of things? When I'm performing, obviously every performance isn't the same. It's different every time. And yet you strive to send that same kind of energy out there. But sometimes I might not be feeling as well as I am other nights. And so there are these other variants about communication. And so I often wonder how ready am I to be tuned in to receive that energy from God as me being the audience member for it? Am I available as an audience member for God's communication? Or am I always trying to be the communicator and try to tell God what to do? No, God, you're in the audience. I'm the one sending the light out. You know what I mean? It's this, how often am I available to know what role I'm playing? We talk about that a lot too. What if I'm a customer at the convenience store, or if I'm at the doctor's office and here I am available to give this other person comfort, and I'm concerned about, is she going to take it the wrong way or is she going to take it the right way? Am I going to be a weirdo or not? I don't know. And then just quieting down and having the sense that just say you're sorry, she's in pain. Just connect that way. So I often ask myself, how available am I?
Yeah, yeah. And awful lot of the world of life is not writ large. You're not out there trying to save the world or something,
Right. Yeah.
It really consists often of these tiny moments. And they're tiny moments, in part, what you're describing, Scott. They're tiny moments where you're either paying attention to the other person, as well as your own internal sense of what you're called to do in interaction with this person. And you just need to rise to the moment. And the moment may be just a little moment, of just saying thank you or something to the checkout person. That's a tiny moment. What could be tinier? But that's a tiny moment, and yet it's not nothing. The world is made up of tiny moments. You might say the centuries and historical trends are made up of individual human gestures, one person to another, and then the response to those gestures. As that woman responded to you, she didn't just. One of the things I don't like is you give a compliment to a person and they discount the compliment. Oh no, I'm the worst, whatever. I had a friend who did that routinely. You couldn't say anything good about her, though she did many good things, because she would always discount it. And I always thought that's a mistake. If someone says something good to you, whether you feel it's deserved or not, thank them. They've done a good thing. And so, you're right to focus on both sides of these interactions of understanding, being understood, paying attention, hopefully being paid attention to. Sometimes you have to demand attention. They're not paying attention. So you say to the waiter or somebody, person seating people, hey, we're next. Oh, okay. So sometimes you have to demand attention. That's fine too. But you demand attention, I guess you might put it, in a loving way, not to insult someone or be in your face or show dominance or superiority or something, but you do it in, hey fella, we're next. Don't forget. And you can do it in a perfectly kind and loving way. So go to it, because that's the warp and woof of human life, is these relationships, the web of relationships. And you've got to keep them. It's sometimes somebody says, like repairing spider webs with your fingers. I mean, they're very subtle, the web of relationships. But if you pay attention, you can repair. You can keep those little threads in good repair and vibrantly satisfying to both sides of the communication.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.